Hey everyone, so this right here is the 5E3 guitar amp that I built from scratch in a relatively recent video. And it's been a great amp so far, I love it, I play it pretty much every day. But after I built it, there were some modifications and changes that needed to happen. And I'd also like to just kind of give an ownership report of the amp since I've had it since November now, because I built it way back in November. So yeah, that's what this video is going to be about today, so let's get started. Alright, so before we get into the ownership report here, I'm going to talk about a bunch of little modifications that I made to the amp after I finished building it and after I published that video. And most of those changes take place inside the chassis. The first thing I did was I put some aluminum foil tape on the inside of the back panel and grounded it to the chassis through this little ground wire. And I guess this probably isn't the best way to do the ground wire attaching it to the back panel, but I couldn't really think of another way without having to have a big ugly bolt sticking out of the back panel. And this is theoretically supposed to reduce hum, but I honestly didn't really notice a difference. I just kind of left it there because it's not hurting anything, but I didn't really notice a noise reduction. But I guess there are probably some heat shielding benefits there, so there's that. But overall, the back panel shielding wasn't a huge success or a failure. The next change I made was a more important one, and that was that I replaced all of the 8-pin tube sockets with Beltons. I'd used these really crappy ones that a lot of people kind of commented, like, you use crappy tube sockets, and they were kind of right because they were super loose. The preamp tube sockets were fine, I'm still using those here, but the output tube sockets really needed to go. The only thing with mounting the Beltons was the 1-inch holes I had drilled for the other ones were too small, so I had to mount the Beltons on these little rubber spacers because the inner diameter of the Belton tube sockets is 1 inch, but the outer one, or the one to mount it flush, is just slightly bigger. But mounting it on spacers was fine, no real issue with that there, and all I had to do was just drill out the rivets for the old tube sockets, unsolder all the wires, put in the new sockets, and solder the wires back on. And it wasn't that big a deal, and everything kind of just went fine. The next change is a pretty small one, but I think it's worth mentioning. When I originally built the amp, I wired the cathode bypass cap and the cathode resistor for the 6v6s touching each other, which I later found out isn't a great idea because that can damage the capacitor due to too much heat from the resistor. So I replaced both of those things so that I could have longer lead lengths, and when I replaced them, I decided to use a 10-watt resistor instead of a 5-watt one, and also a 50-volt cap instead of a 25-volt cap, just because a lot of people recommend doing that. It was extra like 20 cents, so I figured why not. And the final modification that I did was another important one, and that was that I actually replaced the speaker baffle. And the reason I did this is because when I originally built the amp, for some reason, I decided to use kind of crappy plywood that I had laying around for the speaker baffle. And after a while, I realized that that board was kind of warped, and I really didn't want my speaker bolted to a warped piece of wood. I also used some really delicate, stretchy, and thin grill cloth, which was not doing a very good job of protecting the speaker, and it actually got kind of baggy and loose. So a speaker baffle was definitely something I needed to do. I used really nice birch plywood this time, and I used some acoustic fabric that I bought online that was a lot tougher. And I think it looks better now because the color of that fabric is really great, and the speaker is definitely more protected too. Alright, so I'm pretty sure that's everything for post-build modifications and updates. I can't really think of anything else that I did to the amp other than those things. But I would like to give a brief ownership report, having had the amp for a little over 5 months now, because I built this thing back in November. So overall it's been great. I use it pretty much every day, and I've actually been using it pretty often just as a practice amp, which is generally like, people don't really recommend it for that, but you can keep the volume low enough, especially you can also just use the volume on your guitar to keep it low even if you're playing right next to it, and if you need overdrive without cranking it, you can just use an overdrive pedal, which kind of seems a little bit weird considering how this amp is known for its great overdrive, using an overdrive pedal with it, but it's whatever, it sounds fine, and if you really want to crank it, you can. But yeah, so been playing it all the time, even as a practice amp. I think it works great. The clean tones on this are also really amazing, even though I think it's more known for the overdrive. About the overdrive, though, that kind of goes into my next comment on having played this thing for a while. So I recently built a 5F2A chassis, which is pretty much a champ with a tone control, and that's going to be an amp that I'm going to sell. Now that I have a little more experience, I think I can build these things to be high quality enough to sell. So I haven't built a cabinet for that yet, but I have the working chassis. And the only reason I'm not doing a video on that is because it would be pretty much the exact same build as this. I'm going with the same cabinet style. The only difference is that I did not make the chassis this time just for cost effectiveness. So it would pretty much just be this build except watered down a little bit, which I don't know if that would make the best content. But anyway, so I have this working 5F2A chassis, and I've been playing it through this cabinet, and I actually like the overdrive on that amp better than this amp, I think. They're definitely different, and like I said, that's pretty much just you're going to get the exact same tone as a champ with a 5F2A, my understanding. But yeah, so I've been testing out the 5F2A through this speaker cabinet, and I think the overdrive actually sounds better. It gets a little bit more crunchy than this does at full volume, and it's just a little tighter. The 5E3 is a little more like loose and kind of weird, but I mean that's kind of its thing, I think. I still really love the overdrive that you get from this amp, but personally I honestly kind of like the champ / 5F2A overdrive tone better. Other than that, I have not played live or played in really like a gig setting with this yet, although I might be somewhat soon, and I'm pretty confident in its abilities to. I have played in a quiet band setting, and it held up fine as far as like being able to play relatively loudly without having to worry about going into overdrive too much, especially with having a little switchable negative feedback option there. That's pretty great. If you want to keep it cleaner for longer at louder volumes, then that's kind of a handy thing. I think if I were to recommend or do this build again, I would still include the negative feedback switch. That reminds me, coupling cap switch, which is way back here, very difficult to reach, but you kind of never use it, so it's okay. The coupling cap switch, like I said, documented in the earlier video, it just switches between higher and lower value coupling caps on the first one, I believe. Yeah, the first coupling cap in the circuit. And that's to reduce like too much bass and kind of like farting out with humbuckers. But I honestly don't really notice any difference at all with the switchable coupling caps, and I actually don't have any problems with the farting out when I play with humbuckers. My main guitar that I use is a Les Paul, so humbuckers. It also has the switchable, the push-pull pots so you can switch to single coils, but I use the humbucker setting most of the time with this amp, and I've tried adjusting its stock form and with the other coupling cap switched on, and I've never had any issues with farting out, interestingly, which is something that people complain about with this amp a lot. But I guess it's nice having the option there, but I honestly don't really notice the difference. I guess that's pretty much it. Final notes. One other thing I would like to note is, based on what I've seen online, it seems like mine kind of stays cleaner for longer, and doesn't get into as much overdrive as other ones I've seen, or seen on YouTube. I haven't actually heard any other 5E3s in real life. But just kind of interesting thing. I don't really know why that is. I'm kind of okay with it. I like having the extra headroom, but it doesn't seem to break up as quickly, which is kind of an interesting thing. But that's pretty much it for the 5E3 ownership report. This is my main amp. It's probably going to be my main amp for a while. Although, since I like that 5F2A, I will probably be building a 5F2A from scratch, because I have my first ever amp that I built was a Champ, which I also built from scratch, but it is pretty rough around the edges. It's not the best looking chassis or cabinet. So my plan is, in a future video, to rebuild that Champ that I don't really use anymore. It's kind of like sketchy first amp kind of thing. I'm going to be rebuilding that Champ, taking all the parts out of it, and building it into a really nice scratch-built 5F2A. So stay tuned for that video. It might be a bit before that one comes out, but it's coming. So yeah, that's pretty much everything. If you could subscribe for future videos, that would be great. Hit the like button if you like it, and I'll see you next time.